happening. Here we go. I think I fixed it. There we go. All right. So let's start this discussion about what is going on today with some serious history about what led us to today. All right. So I'm going to go through, we're going to traipse through a little bit of history. Well, we're going to traipse through a lot of history. And I only got an hour. So let's get to it. Now, on January 8th, 1811, over 500 Africans from 50 different nations with 50 different languages waged a fight against U.S. troops and the territorial militias for their freedom in Louisiana. Now, this revolt was called the German Coast Uprising or the Louisiana Slave Revolt, and it got started about 30 miles upriver from New Orleans. At that time, New Orleans was the capital of what was called the Orleans Territory, and this revolt sought to capture the city of New Orleans and make it the capital of another independent Black republic. Now, the principal organizer and leader of this revolt was a man named Charles, who was a laborer and enslaved man on the Deslandes plantation. The Deslandes family had been one of many San Domingo slaveholding families that fled the Haitian Revolution to Louisiana for refuge. In their escape from Haiti, the Deslandes family brought their chattel property, Charles and others with them, and restarted their slaveholding sugarcane operations in Louisiana. Now, the Haitian Revolution, which happened between 1791 and 1804, was met with a combination of, believe it or not, pragmatic accommodation, horror, and hostility by U.S. politicians and plantation owners at the time. Southern plantation owners were terrified and paranoid at the success of enslaved Africans in overthrowing their masters and establishing a free state anywhere in the world, but especially one so close to the U.S. in the Western Hemisphere. It sent shock waves through the slave holding South, the Haitian Revolution did. Plantation owners lived in constant fear that this contagion of rebellion would inspire more uprisings among their own enslaved populations. But honestly, we know our people were rising up and fighting for their freedom and liberation from the moment the Europeans set foot on the continent, from the moment our people set foot on these shores. We know we were rebelling. So, Southern states tightened slave codes that they already had, restricting or further restricting the movement and assembly of enslaved people, and they increased patrols of enslaved people, and that's where the police come from. They also suppressed news and discussion of Haiti to prevent enslaved people from learning about the revolution. I don't know why they thought that's how people find things out, but that's what they did. It was already illegal for the enslaved to read, but the denial of information and the punishment for being informed just got worse. Now, the weird thing is that out of economic interest, some Southern planters, particularly from French Louisiana, accepted this influx of French Caribbean refugees, both the slave owners and the enslaved property, in the early 1790s. But doing this also increased the possibility that these refugees brought firsthand accounts of the uprising, which the same Southern plantation owners and politicians punished the enslaved for knowing about. Makes no sense, but this is typical of the lack of logic of white supremacy. They can't get rich without exploiting us, but they hate having us near them or hearing anything from us. They don't want to see us, they don't want to hear us. But they also won't stop exploiting us. So we won't stop rising up against their exploitation. So they stay accusing us of being ungrateful or being violent or whatever it is they accuse us of to delegitimize us. And the vicious cycle of lies, accusation, projection, exploitation, repression, violence, uprising continues with every single U.S. administration. But it wasn't just Southern politicians who responded to the Haitian Revolution with more repression. The federal government also, consistently shaped by the nation's racial hierarchy and geopolitical maneuvering around Haiti's successful revolution in ways that we often don't connect. In the 1790s, the US government had this initial neutrality and trade agreements under Presidents Washington, yes, George Washington, and the next one, Adams. The US maintained unofficial trade relations with Saint Domingue before it was the revolutionary Haiti, because the northern merchant economy benefited from trade with the island, even though they saw this slave rebellion cooking. The pragmatic approach to Haiti as an independent and sovereign Black nation continued under the Adams administration, which lasted 1797 to 1801, because the Adams administration briefly provided aid to guess who? Toussaint Louverture in his conflict with French royalists. Why? Because Adams saw Louverture as a stabilizing force who could protect American commercial interests from the French. Now, look, that was a purely strategic move. Nobody in the US government endorsed Black liberation in Haiti, but it should be clearly understood that there were some in US political society who approached the Haitian Revolution as an economic and geopolitical benefit for them, even as they hated the precedent it set for their own system of slavery in this country. So from 1801 onward, though, it was President Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner himself, and the president who everybody loves to continue to prop up as not so bad a guy, who represented a sharp reversal from that cautious pragmatism toward revolutionary Haiti, because Jefferson was horrified by the slave rebellion and fearful of its example. So Jefferson cooperated with Napoleon to try to reconquer Haiti in 1802 and 1803, allowing French ships to restock their supplies in American ports. This is what President Thomas Jefferson did. Very much like the way the US collaborates with the violent and racist right wing in countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and the money grubbing capitalist turncoats in countries like Nigeria, Congo, Rwanda, Trinidad, Tobago, etc., to return those countries to the control of the former European colonists in order to establish neo-colonial control over those countries, or to allow the US to control their resources and governments and people. Jefferson also refused diplomatic recognition of the independent Black Republic of Haiti, and at the urging of US Southern legislators, imposed a severe economic embargo on Haiti. Yes, he did. The goal of the economic embargo that Jefferson imposed on Haiti was to isolate Haiti economically and cause it to fail, preventing the spread of those crazy abolitionist ideas to the rest of the enslaved Negroes. Now, did you know that Thomas Jefferson's economic embargo on Haiti was a significant early instance of a U.S. trade restriction? It was driven by fear of slave revolts and hostility toward the new Black Republic, though the U.S. had used similar economic coercion before, like the Navigation Act against Britain. That and those kinds of policies weren't designed to destroy another country, just to tell these other countries, no, you can't do this to us because we're independent now too, right? But the Haitian embargo was a targeted, deliberate policy to isolate and suppress a nation for perhaps the first time in US history. The economic embargo against Haiti may have been the template for the sanctions and economic blockade the US has imposed on countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Zimbabwe, and others when they don't behave like the US wants them to today. The United States refused to recognize Haitian independence for nearly 60 years until 1862. By that time, the southern states had drove that posture toward Haiti had seceded, and they were in the midst of the Civil War. But this 60 years of isolation and demonization of the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere denied Haiti diplomatic legitimacy with the intention of thwarting normal trade relations with the country, which limited Haiti's development. And it was all done solely because of the belief that the US ruling class capitalists did not want to give up the empire building profits from their African chattel, who might be inspired by Haiti's example to fight for and win their freedom. But our ancestors, like I said before, always fought for their freedom, as the uprisings and rebellions of the enslaved throughout the slave system before Haiti's revolution shows. But this is the blueprint for denial of a nation's sovereignty when the US government opposes what they're doing with their resources and money. When Hugo Chavez was elected president in Venezuela in 1999 with overwhelming support from the Venezuelan people, the US cautiously recognized his win, but not fully, because he won with overwhelming support from the Venezuelan working class, poor, peasants, indigenous, and Afro descended people. When Chavez privatized the Venezuelan oil company PDVSA again, the US began to attack him after he started using Venezuela's oil revenue to provide housing, healthcare, education, and food to the working class, poor, and peasant people in Venezuela that elected him because they were the people who were left out of the previous US backed political process in the country. So, US politicians like then Secretary of State Colin Powell and CIA Director George Tenet began demonizing Chavez in hearings before Congress, setting the stage for US intervention. Chavez, who had been president for just 2 years, had committed two other unforgivable offenses against the US, you see. He held meetings with the leaders of the sworn enemies of the US, Cuba, Iran, and Libya, and he had the nerve to criticize the US response to 9/11 in Afghanistan. Why did he do that? Because that's what got Chavez kidnapped by the fascist coup plotters backed by the US in the Venezuelan right wing opposition and facilitated by the media. Chavez was secreted away and held captive for 2 days while the Venezuelan people were told by the media that there was a new president in town. And then the people took to the streets, demanded the return of their president, and overturned the coup. But this is also when the US began imposing economic coercive measures against Venezuela, otherwise known as sanctions, that every US administration just kept adding to, just like the US did with Haiti. Then, when Chavez died and Nicolas Maduro won the election in 2013, the US started acting toward Venezuela the same way that Thomas Jefferson acted toward Haiti, by not recognizing Maduro's election win at all, saying it was legitimate, denying recognizing Venezuela as a legitimate sovereign state worthy of US respect. But this time, it was everyone's favorite Black president that did the imperial deed. President Barack Obama refused to recognize the first election of Nicolas Maduro and immediately called for a full recount. The election was close, but a close election doesn't mean it was illegitimate, does it? No. Why was the election close, though? How about Chavez had just died? The people were in deep mourning. They loved that man. And they didn't really know Maduro that well, only that Chavez had chosen him as his successor, but they still had to vote for him. But even though the right wing tried to capitalize on Chavez's death and demonized him by blaming the economic problems of the country on Chavez, rather than on US sanctions and US aggression, the people took a chance on Maduro anyway, and they have not stopped supporting him since. But in 2013, Obama took up the call of the oil barons in the US and the racist right wing in Venezuela, who said the election was rigged and demanded an audit in an attempt to push Maduro out. It was Obama in 2015 who issued an executive order declaring a national emergency in the US with respect to the quote, unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States posed by the situation in Venezuela. The targeted sanctions in the executive order implement the Venezuela Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act of 2014, which the President, Obama, signed on December 18th, 2014, and also go beyond the requirements of that legislation, end quote. And that is a quote from the fact sheet on Obama's Venezuela executive order issued on March 9th, 2015. You're going to have to look that up to read how disgustingly dishonest it is and how not that different from what Trump and Kristi Noem and the DOJ have said and done about Venezuela just this week. Then in 2018, when the Venezuelan right-wing opposition refused to participate in the elections at all, but still claimed Maduro stole the election when he won, the U.S. again refused to recognize the result after a massive housing project in which 3.5 million housing units were built for the working class and poor, which I saw with my own eyes when I visited Venezuela in 2022. The right wing in Venezuela that wanted to use that oil money to enrich themselves knew they could not win a popular vote against the Maduro government that undertook that project. So US politicians under the first Trump administration recognized Juan Guaido as president, even though Guaido did not run, which of course the US knew. They didn't care. They said Guaido was president anyway and issued a bounty for the capture of Maduro for bogus charges of narco trafficking. Then Biden refused to recognize the 2024 election that Maduro also won by at least 60% of the votes. And he doubled, Biden did, the Trump bounty on Maduro's head, knowing all of the accusations against him were blatant lies. And here we are with this administration using the US military to kidnap Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia from their bedroom in the middle of the night, murdering up to 100 Venezuelans and Cubans, just like George Bush kidnapped Panamanian President Manuel Noriega in Panama. And the US military murdered and made homeless tens of thousands of Panamanians. That's right. This is not new. Coming into office in 1989, George Bush didn't like Panama's leader, General Manuel Noriega's new attitude toward the US. President George Bush called Noriega a dictator too, but President Reagan and Vice President Bush overlooked all of the abuses that Noriega committed before Bush became president. Why? Because Noriega cooperated with the CIA in a lot of ways, like offering Panama as a base for operations for the US to move against the Sandinistas and meeting with Oliver North to discuss sabotage, coordinating with the Contras in Nicaragua. When he was director of the CIA in 76 and 77, George Bush protected Noriega. Why? Because he was on the CIA's payroll for years as an intelligence asset. So the US government certainly knew what Noriega was doing regarding drug trafficking and gun running because he was doing it for the US. They were fine with it as long as they got what they wanted out of him. But by 1987, Noriega's usefulness to the US was over. His activities in the drug trade were out in the open. I wonder how that happened. And he became a convenient target for an administration that wanted to prove that the United States, that was unable to destroy the Castro government in Cuba, or the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, or the revolutionary movement in El Salvador, was still powerful in the Caribbean. So they sacrificed their asset, Noriega, by indicting him in Florida for drug trafficking, claiming the U.S. needed to protect U.S. citizens because a U.S. soldier and his wife was threatened by Panamanian soldiers. And then the U.S. invaded Panama in December 1989 with 26,000 troops. Noriega was captured, brought to Florida to stand trial, found guilty, and sent to prison. But in the invasion, civilian neighborhoods in Panama City were bombed and hundreds, maybe thousands of civilians were killed. There has never been an official and accurate count. It has been estimated that 14,000 people were made homeless, and that's an underestimation. And the U.S. has never acknowledged the damage done to the citizens of Panama who were brutalized in the invasion, nor has it ever rectified the damage to those people the invasion caused. Just like the U.S. government continues not to care what it does to the people in the countries it believes it has a right to invade, to coup their leaders, like Venezuela and every other country being threatened now, rather than allowing the people in those countries to deal with their problems, whatever they are or are not, on their own. Finally, the Haitian Revolution also created a profound ideological conflict for the American public that we still contend with today, because Haitians' liberation struggle was a Republican revolution like America's own, fought against colonial rule, which some U.S. observers initially admired. Now, I don't mean Republican as in the political party. I mean Republican as in a state in which ultimate power is held by the people and their elected officials, where there's equality among citizens, and which has an elected or nominated president rather than a monarch. And I think it's worth noting, understanding that definition of a republic, that even the United States was never the republic people claim it was and still claim it is today, because there has never been equality among the members of the society in the US at any time. And that's the point at which Americans disconnected from the Haitian Revolution, because it was also an anti slavery and racial revolution, which directly challenged the foundation of the Southern economy and the racial order of the entire United States. In typical European American settler colonial fashion, this tension between American ideals of liberty and equality and the American reality of bondage and subhuman degradation for African and indigenous people and their descendants was resolved by white Americans prioritizing white supremacy and the preservation of slavery over the ideals that America was allegedly founded on of universal liberty for all. Why? Because of the color of some folks' skin and their established role in early U.S. society as the backs on which European descended profit and progress had to be made. For enslaved Africans and their descendants, Haiti remained a potent symbol of resistance and hope. For white Americans, especially in the South, it became the ultimate nightmare, shaping pro-slavery arguments and paranoid defenses of slavery for decades. In legislation, too, like the Missouri Compromise of 1820, in which Southern congressmen explicitly cited the Haitian Revolution as a reason to limit the expansion of slavery into the new territories. Understand, the fight over whether slavery was going to be a part of the acceptance of new states into the Union was not done over moral opposition to slavery, but out of fear that concentrating too many slaves in one area could lead to a repeat of the Haitian Revolution in the US. During this time, limiting the expansion of slavery into the new territories in the West was also advocated for by poor European immigrants who immigrated from the South looking for land and economic opportunity they could not acquire in Europe or in the US South because their major competition for labor was the enslaved and the free Black population. So, in the Western and other territories stolen from the indigenous, the fight to not expand slavery was about protecting white workers from having to compete with the Black enslaved or free population. Poor European immigrants, despite their struggle against worker exploitation in industrialized Europe, when they immigrated to the colonies here, the new United States, they failed to extend labor solidarity to the enslaved and free Black people. Instead of uniting against the bosses, these poor white immigrants viewed Black laborers who were legally exploited for forced free labor as competition instead of seeing them as oppressed workers, choosing racism over solidarity. And many of them absolutely hated Black people. They hated slavery because slavery made Black people compete for labor they believed should be theirs. And they ended up siding with the bosses who were stealing from everyone. So don't tell me that race is a secondary issue to class in this country. Poor European immigrants did not want to compete for jobs or land with any Black people. So race was a primary labor issue for them. And we continue to see this dynamic thwart any advancement of the labor movement in this country today. Now, the European influence weighed heavily on growing US hegemonic ambitions in another way by inspiring the policy that is at the foundation of the latest imperialist coup in Venezuela today, a policy that we may not realize is also heavily influenced by fascist US attitudes toward the Haitian Revolution. A lot of people are talking about the Monroe Doctrine today after the US kidnapping of President Maduro and the First Lady. The doctrine was established in 1823, and you can look that up. It's a good thing people are talking about it, though, because what we need to understand about the Monroe Doctrine is that while it was initially aimed at Europe, because Germany and Italy were running around gobbling up other people's countries, and the European immigrants and their descendants in the US, remember that's where they came from, didn't want to be anybody's colony again after they stole this land from the indigenous that they genocided. So they were telling the Europeans with the Monroe Doctrine, you're not coming over here. We're not going to be your colony anymore. But the Monroe Doctrine was also an effort by the US to prevent further destabilizing revolutions in the Western Hemisphere, specifically like the Haitian Revolution. That's right. The Monroe Doctrine was partially inspired by the success and the threat posed to countries in the Western Hemisphere by the Haitian Revolution. This country's government wanted no other country in the Western Hemisphere to believe it could overthrow its colonizers because the US wanted to be the new colonizers to replace Europe. That's the history, y'all, and that's why we have to talk about it. But it is 30 minutes past the hour, and you know it's time for that WPFW station break. So, engineer extraordinaire, what do we have on tap for the people today?
Good news, family. You can now take WPFW everywhere you go with our brand new WPFW radio app. Stream Jazz and Justice live, listen to archived shows, view the program schedule and playlists, donate, and more, all right from your phone. Download the WPFW radio app today from Apple App or Google Play stores. WPFW in your pocket. Jazz and Justice wherever you are.
All right, thank you so much. We were talking on the other side of the break about the Monroe Doctrine, why we're talking about it in relation to what's going on today, and what it has to do with the history of Reconstruction and the Haitian Revolution. So let's start with this. So when these white supremacist, settler colonial, white Christian, nationalist, American, Nazi freaks like Stephen Miller talk about controlling the Western Hemisphere simply because this place is in it, understand that this is not a new attitude. It is simply the Monroe Doctrine under this Trump regime. Not new, but part of the very foundation of this country. And every single US president has adhered to it with every foreign policy they have ever put forward. All of them, every single one. For those of us who oppose imperialism, this is why our focus is not ever on a single president, but on the US government and the capitalist system it rests upon itself. This government was never established to serve the needs of its own citizens, nor serve the needs of or even get along with the people of any other nation. Its singular purpose is to ensure that anything of value possessed by others, anything that could potentially generate wealth for the few, is not made available for the benefit of the many, of the people, anywhere in the world, but it is to be controlled only by the already rich and very small, but already very powerful capitalist ruling class in this country and their allies in their empire. The impact of US aggression toward other countries that this historical response to the Haitian Revolution caused has never ended. Haiti is still being punished for defeating the Europeans and the US and gaining its independence to this day. And countries throughout the global South are still subject to the Monroe Doctrine, as we've just seen. The working class and poor in other countries can never be allowed to profit from their own resources, and their revolutionary examples can never be allowed to stand to inspire workers in the US and the West to do the same. This is why the US demonizes countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, China. The AES, the Alliance of the Sahel States, is on the list now, as was or as were Burkina Faso, Mali, Mozambique, Algeria, Ghana, and other African nations that defeated the original European colonial powers. Now, what happened to the German Coast Uprising in Louisiana? I'm sure you're wondering, because we did start the show talking about that. Well, after the rebels, men and women, by the way, on foot and on horseback, sacked the plantation of Colonel Manuel Andre, they marched toward New Orleans shouting, "On to New Orleans, freedom or death." However, the revolt was put down on January 11th, and many of the leaders and participants were killed by the slave owners' militias and U.S. federal troops. Some of the leaders were captured, placed on trial, and later executed, their heads cut off, and placed on poles along the river in order to frighten and intimidate the other enslaved. And this display of heads on spikes stretched over 60 miles. 60. So please tell me why you're surprised and shocked and so beside yourself with disbelief that masked, deputized race warrior Klansmen and their melanated class traitor brethren are running around assaulting and murdering people in the streets of the US in these so-called ICE raids today. This is the norm in this country. When we say this type of violence has always been the reality for us here, we mean it. Y'all just don't want to hear it until, of course, it comes down your street. In that video going viral right now of the little white boy with the megaphone screaming at anti-ICE protesters, screaming at them, talking about the storm is here, nothing can't stop it. And we executed one of you yesterday, because he was talking about the murder of Renee Nicole Good in Minneapolis, that video. Don't think that he's talking about Nazi Germany. He's talking about the fascist white supremacist violence that has always been the foundation of this country in its history. This history matters because it is what we have been fighting our entire existence here. The German Coast Uprising also matters to this discussion because that uprising weakened the system of chattel slavery. It inspired more revolts in the following years and set the stage for the Civil War. And here's the interesting thing: the children and the grandchildren of the rebels in the German Coast Uprising contributed 28,000 soldiers to the Union Army, more than any other state. So don't fix your mouth to tell me that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. No. The enslaved freed this country from slavery. The thing is, this country really just liked slavery and oppression too much to fully let it go. Americans love the profits from oppression and the social comfort from equality so much that they allowed fascism to destroy the attempts to reconstruct the South with progressive policies after the Civil War. Without the coup of Reconstruction in the US, because that's what it was, we may not have seen US coups in so many other countries, because this country might have been a lot more equal if Reconstruction had been allowed to stand, which could have facilitated a lot more peace around the world and a lot better life for us. But too many people pay no attention to Reconstruction. But it is too important a period of time for us to continue to ignore, because the end of Reconstruction is, as far as I can tell, the first formal coup against a democratically elected government under the racist ideology of this country. I could be wrong, but I think it is. And it may have been the first organized political attack on progressivism in this country, such as progressivism was at that time in early US political history. I'm just guessing, but I just think it is. Now, the term progressive must be understood in the historical context of the 1860s and 1870s and not compared one to one with modern progressivism, but that is where it emerged. The radical standards of that era rather, especially in the defeated South. This was after the Civil War and the South had lost, allegedly. The Reconstruction state governments were profoundly progressive and revolutionary. And they were often slandered and pejoratively called the radical Republican government or the Black Republican governments as insults, because one of the ways they were so revolutionary was because they were interracial. It was the first example of an interracial government in this country. But also, if you want to know when the word radical became a cuss word in the United States, this might be the origin. But yeah, the Reconstruction governments were progressive and could have drastically changed the trajectory of US society and potentially the world in ways that would have benefited the people instead of the ruling class. And I'm going to try to compare these areas to the ways the US government claims malfeasance among the countries it wants to dominate in similar ways today. So, yeah, Reconstruction's most revolutionary feature was establishing a biracial democracy. The 1867 Reconstruction Acts mandated Southern states ratify the 14th Amendment and grant Black men the right to vote. This created a new political base of freedmen, Northern carpetbaggers, and Southern scalawags. You're just going to have to look up those terms, carpetbaggers and scalawags. But for the first time in US history, Black men, white men in the North, and white men in the South was this new political base. Black political participation was created and increased. Well, not really created, because before slavery, Black people had the right to vote in some colonies in this place. Didn't know that, did you? Uh-huh. Yeah. Hundreds of thousands of Black men voted because of the Reconstruction governments. Between 1868 and 1877, at least 2,000 Black men held public office, including local positions, state legislatures, lieutenant governors, 16 U.S. congressmen, and 2 senators, Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce of Mississippi. Look up how long it took before there was another Black senator in the U.S. Senate. Yeah. But this was a seismic shift in a region, the South, built on racial hierarchy and slavery. And today, US politicians routinely deny the will of the mostly working class, poor, indigenous, Afro descended peasant populations in the global South countries that it hates, like the way it regularly denies the legitimacy of elections in Venezuela. And people continue to claim that Venezuelans are celebrating the coup against Maduro, while the US media ignores hundreds of videos of tens of thousands of people in the streets of Caracas protesting to demand Maduro's return. The US government and a lot of white people in the US side with the white right wing, say that fast 5 times, in those countries that are always opposed to progressive policies that help the masses who are largely brown, indigenous, black. The US will ignore a democratic election every time the right wing racist reactionaries in that country do not want to be governed by those people's power. And then the new continuous constitutions, rather, written in these Reconstruction governments in the South between 1868 and 1869 were among the most progressive in the nation at the time because they abolished property and racial qualifications for voting. They established the South's first state funded universal public school systems that were to be open to all children, black and white, even though in the states, a lot of them segregated those public schools. And these constitutions included clauses banning racial discrimination in public accommodations and transportations before the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Yes, there was the first Civil Rights Act that was passed in this country, but it wasn't passed until 1875, after these Reconstruction constitutions that outlawed racial discrimination were already written. And then these constitutions reduced property qualifications for office holding, made more offices elective, and reappointed legislatures more fairly. So if the masses are educated and are allowed full participation in the democratic process, which is what these Reconstruction governments were putting in place, the ruling elite would never win an election. So they responded by making sure that people can only learn what the ruling class wants them to learn, so that they keep the people obedient by keeping them ignorant, keeping them compliant, and conditioning the people to never question the ruling class by limiting the information they have about their own history. And as many people as possible are kept out of the electoral process. In every country, in every case, the people resist this obvious exclusion from their own country's political, social, and economic development, though. That's what people's protests in these countries are always about: their right to national sovereignty and self determination without foreign influence or coercion to tell them how to solve their internal problems. So when we see the people protesting in the streets in Venezuela demanding the return of Maduro, of course, the US government doesn't want you to see those protests, and they show you the protests of the white right wing that hates Maduro and the socialist Bolivarian project in Venezuela. Just like they're only showing you the protests from earlier in Iran that were anti government, but they're not showing you the pro government protests that are 10 times the size going on in Iran right now. All right? Then the Reconstruction governments sought to rebuild and modernize the war ravaged South. They invested heavily in railroads, bridges, roads, public buildings to repair war damage and stimulate economic development. But of course, the racist white folks criticized this, saying, oh, it's just leading to debt and corruption. But really, The intent was to create a modern integrated economy. But can we be serious? These folks were not concerned about debt. These are the same people who went into debt to buy human beings to enslave. They didn't care about debt. They didn't like the fact that their former chattel could possibly benefit from any of their money. And if that meant they had to keep the infrastructure crappy so that Black people and indigenous and the immigrants they didn't like didn't benefit from anything their money went to, then that's what they did. And that is what they did. But these Reconstruction governments also overhauled antiquated legal systems and established orphanages, penitentiaries, and asylums for the mentally ill, moving social welfare from private to public responsibility. So these penitentiaries that the Reconstruction governments created, who do you think those penitentiaries were for? The penitentiaries were for the violent white supremacists who were murdering the now freed, formerly enslaved people because they were free. Providing public services through orphanages and asylums for everyone, and moving care for people with particular and unique issues like orphans and mentally ill people from being something that only rich people could afford to the government providing this service for everyone. Then these Reconstruction governments protected the fundamental economic right of freed people specifically to own land and to labor for themselves. Now, if the white ruling class in the US hated the Reconstruction governments for trying to rebuild US infrastructure to benefit the people, does it make a little bit more sense now why the same US government today continues to disparage China for its Belt and Road Initiative? Do you see why this government demonizes China for being the new imperialist in Africa, allegedly? It's not because that's true. It's because this government wants China out of Africa. So the US can keep being involved in it and step in further and be the imperialist power to use Africa as a geopolitically strategic weapon against non-aligned imperialist or anti-imperialist countries, rather, like China. That's why the US does not want the Africans, the former colonized workers of their friends in Europe. The US does not want those Africans to benefit from that advanced infrastructure that China is building throughout, with the consensual and mutually beneficial agreements that African governments are making with the China. The US government does not want that. The US government wants to be able to step in and control the resources in these African countries, and China is not doing that. But the US government also wants to destroy China because China is not exploiting people. All right? But then these Reconstruction governments themselves, their very existence was predicated on the progressive constitutional amendments, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th. Now, I know the 13th Amendment has that awful exclusion clause that is a bipartisan compromise between Northern and Southern whites, which is why bipartisanship is dangerous. The 14th Amendment established birthright citizenship, equal protection under the law, and due process, fundamentally altering the federal state relationship to protect individual rights, or at least it was supposed to, because the 14th Amendment, since it has been ratified, has been used more to protect corporate rights than it has been used to protect the rights of the people that the amendment was written to protect. But when they were written, when they were voted on and ratified, these amendments were progressive. And of course, the 15th Amendment prohibited the denial of suffrage based on race. The Reconstruction governments were the living implementation of these supposedly transformative principles. But the ruling class in this country and everywhere else in the world hates progressivism of any kind because progressivism means equality. All of these things are anathema to capitalist dictators who will not share anything with the workers who produce the wealth they keep to themselves. Inequality must be enshrined in law and enforced with violence in order to be able to extract the majority of the economic fruits of the labor of the oppressed workforce. Keeping workers underpaid with little to no benefits that support a decent quality of life, like time off, real lunch hours, life sustaining pay, keeping people sick by destroying food, the environment, limiting healthcare access to full time employment of certain kinds of jobs. These are the ways that the ruling class keeps workers from revolting against them. These are the ways they keep us oppressed, overworked, tired, stressed, too stressed to fight them. It largely works in this country, but it hasn't always. Unfortunately, because we don't like to read, we don't know a lot of that history. The progressivism of the Reconstruction governments is why they faced the virulent, violent opposition and were ultimately overthrown. The accusations of corruption and incompetence, yeah, there was some corruption, but a lot of it was in the North. But these accusations, lies, and racially coded to undermine the legitimacy of Black political power. The same way these lies about people stealing elections in other countries that are mostly populated with Black and brown people, same ideology behind the same lies. And then planters and elites oppose the new social order and the use of their taxes to give anything nice to the Negroes. The same way white people in this country today do not want their tax dollars to go to providing anything nice for Black people, immigrants, queer people, anybody who they don't like. And then groups like the Ku Klux Klan, White Leagues, and Red Shirts launched this campaign of political violence, political terrorist violence to assassinate, intimidate, and overthrow Republican officials and voters, Republican officials who were mostly Black at the time. Events like the Colfax Massacre in 1873 and the Hamburg Massacre in 1876 were coups against Reconstruction governments. And then there was the Northern Retreat. By the mid 1870s, Northern white commitment to racial equality went right out the window, down the drain. The Compromise of 1877 sealed the deal, withdrawing federal troops and allowing the so called Redeemer Democrats to violently seize power and end Reconstruction. Fascism cooed Reconstruction in this country. Ultimately, Reconstruction was not ended by political debate or economic pressure alone, but by a sustained, organized campaign of terrorist violence that the federal government ultimately chose not to stop. This violent redemption laid the foundation for the racially oppressive Jim Crow system that would last until the mid 20th century. Today, instead of saying they're cooing governments because of their rejection of Negro dominance, which is what they said when they cooed the Reconstruction governments, today, politicians and people in the US who carry out all this hell on earth our ancestors experienced in this place for 300 years legally, and then for the rest of the 250 years as a bipartisan project in setting up a fascist capitalist dictatorship, cosplaying as a democracy with a free speech and voting aesthetic, because that's what this country is. Instead of saying, no, we don't like Negro dominance, they make up lies about narco terrorism and stealing elections, and then they invade and kidnap and coup. This place has an essence of liberation and equality, but not the actual thing. That's where we are. And this history is why we are where we are. At least a couple of major reasons that propel the ruling class and their acolytes into the ignorant and deadly reality we can't stand to be in right now, but here we are. So that's all the time I have for Darker Than Blue this evening. But if you go to Black Liberation Media on Facebook or YouTube or Lukman Nation on YouTube, stick around because we're going to talk more about the Monroe Doctrine and the fascist coup against Reconstruction and what it means to US imperialism and our people today. But for those of you listening on WPFW, thank you so much for listening. Al luta continua, the struggle continues. But if we keep paying attention to this history, I promise you, Victoria Acerta, victory is certain. Stay tuned for News Views with Garland Nixon. See y'all next week. Peace.
Good
Ooh-wee. All right, y'all. Thank you all so much for sticking around with me. Thanks for joining me tonight here on Now We Are in the Dark Room, where it is moist and dark here. Yes. I have been wanting to talk about this topic, Reconstruction, for a while. It is far too dense a topic to really for this show to give it the justice that it really requires. Um, Normally, I wouldn't recommend this man's books to but Reverend William Barber, really, he wrote this really good book. I really did enjoy the book, The Third Reconstruction, where he talks at length about the destruction of Reconstruction in this country and what it meant to the America that we live in now. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about that. And Eric Foner also wrote a book. Oh, shoot, I can't remember the name of his book, but I'm going to get it in a little bit. But I think his book is actually better about it. But so I really want to talk about the connections between these different issues: Reconstruction, the fascist coup against Reconstruction governments in this country, the Monroe Doctrine, and the imperialism that we're seeing today. So, what this government is doing in Venezuela is no different than what it did to Haiti after its revolution, which is the same thing it has done to countries that they viewed as a threat of a good example to the people they wanted to continue to oppress. So they lied about, interfered in, denied recognition and respect to, sanctioned, invaded, kidnapped, deposed, murdered leaders of other countries to keep them subservient to US dominance. Because the oppressed can never be allowed to rise to the same level as their oppressors. And they sure as hell will never be allowed to rise above them. So whether it's Venezuela or Minnesota or Southeast DC, that history that is the history that's driving all this. So in order to fight this enemy today, We need to understand the totality of that enemy. And that is just not one person behind this chaos. That's why we don't trip about, oh, we don't, it's Trump. We need to stop Trump. No, we need to destroy the system that all of this was built on. Trump is just the later bucket carrier of the filth that is this system. Obama was the last one. Biden was the one before him. Clinton, Carter, Bush's, all of them, Reagan, all of them, Roosevelt, all of them. The entire system upon which this nation was built and continues to terrorize the world on has to go. Right? This is why we don't focus on Trump. So, the violence that ended Reconstruction, when people talk about fascism, what it is, where it came from, how long it's been, what it looks like, I don't want to hear what these fucking people have to say. Because when people talk about, well, this isn't fascism, extrajudicial police killings aren't fascism, the militarization of the police isn't fascism. The denial of First Amendment rights, protester repression, that's not fascism, because it doesn't look like, Weimar Germany, because jackbooted thugs aren't marching through the. I have had white people who call themselves leftists say this to me about these things that we experience, this repression that we experience is not fascism, because it doesn't have the aesthetics of European fascism. And in this way, white people have this, even white leftists have this stuck on stupid attitude that the only thing or the only time something actually matters or is legitimate is when they can point it out in Europe. Like, it didn't happen. It's not bad. It doesn't matter if Europe didn't deal with it. Like, fascism didn't exist anywhere other than Europe. And this hellhole was founded on a whole fucking genocide, ethnic cleansing, land theft, and slavery, chattel slavery at that. But that's not fascism, because it wasn't thousands of jackbooted thugs goose stepping in the streets. But the Nazis themselves say that the United States and its racism inspired them. So, this is why I don't have this conversation about what fascism is or is not and define it and what this is with these white people who keep centering fascism in Europe. They are absolutely ignoring the history of the fascist founding of this country, particularly the fascist violent coup that destroyed Reconstruction. Because the violence that ended Reconstruction governments was primarily carried out by paramilitary terrorist organizations affiliated with the Democratic Party at the time, who were white supremacists. Most notably, well, let me stop, because the Republicans were white supremacists too. None of them liked Black people. It's just that the Republicans said, okay, this isn't right. These are not the principles that we said we founded this country on. But they didn't actually want social equality with Black people. They just didn't want to continue to pay for slavery, because slavery for them, for Republicans, got really, really too hard to maintain. Why? Because of the uprisings. So history really does destroy a lot of uneducated people's uneducated arguments about history. So all of this idea about, oh, not everybody owned slaves, and the slaves were happy and some of them treated their slaves okay, and not all the enslaved wanted to. No, we were fighting to be free from day one. And it was the enslaved who made the institution of slavery untenable, to the point where the people who profited off of the institution of slavery, even the people who didn't directly own slaves, were like, we got to get rid of this shit. Jesus Christ, they're making this impossible to maintain. We got to replace this with something. And that was the key. They didn't want to end slavery and just not, end the oppression of people and the profit from oppressing people. They just wanted to find another way to profit off of oppressing people that wasn't as costly as slavery. Let's be clear about the difference between the white supremacist Democrats and the white supremacist Republicans at that time. Because the Democrats were just like, no, keep them enslaved. No, no, they're our slaves, and they are making our money. And we are going to have more slavery, and every new territory is going to be a slave state. And we are going to kill as many white people as we can to make sure that happens. And they did. Bleeding Kansas and the history of John Brown and his family and his actions leading up to the raid on Harper's Ferry, all of that is connected to this white racist fascist violence to over whether slavery would be expanded to the new territories. This is fascism. I don't know what else you want to call it. But this is where the Democratic Party and white supremacists within the party and the Ku Klux Klan and the White League and the Red Shirts, this is the era it came from. Their campaign of violence, intimidation, and political assassination. So these people talking about the political violence that's new. This country was founded on political violence. What are you talking about? The destruction of Reconstruction proves that. This is why they don't want to talk about it. This is why they don't want you to learn about it. Because this is how they have always been. And here's the thing, y'all. They know this history. The white Christian national Nazi leadership. Yeah, they know this history. They're not ashamed of it at all. They don't want their supporters to know it because they know it's awful. And they sure as hell don't want us to know it because we can throw it back in their faces every time they lie about all this new political violence that the crazy left, and the crazy left can look at the violent racist coup of Reconstruction and say, no, y'all started this shit. We are defending ourselves against you, and we always have been. That's why they don't want to talk about this. This campaign of violence, intimidation, political assassinations systematically overthrew the biracial Republican state governments in the South and disenfranchised Black people, leading to the redemption of the South by white Democratic conservatives. And this is where the Daughters of the Confederacy, their lost cause narrative comes in, the redeemer narrative that they cooked up, the Daughters of the Confederacy. So can we please dispense with this idea that if women just lead everything will be all right? Because it was white women who contributed to this idea that we still have today, that the South were the victims. And the South was genteel and kind, and we didn't oppress the slaves. It just happened. We treated our slaves like family, and they were happy, and they were children, and they didn't understand a lot of things, so we had to treat them all like children. They needed our help because, oh my, if we left them in Africa, where would they be? They would be eaten by lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. This idea of a genteel South, nice, kind, sweet Southern people who just wanted to take care of the childlike, innocent, naive, stupid, fucking backward Negroes who were so motherfucking lazy they had to be forced to work under the whip. That shit came from white women in organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy, and these conservative organizations like it from the South, from the white women who were mad that their genteel, comfortable lifestyle was taken away from them by freeing their slaves. That's where this came. That's where this idea of the South being genteel came from. And it was solidified through US media, through movies and television and cartoons. Movies like Gone with the Fucking Wind. This is why we hate that shit. This is why we don't watch that shit today. Do you understand? That's what that movie and movies like it were. Birth of a Nation. Same thing. Solidifying through US media the ideology of a genteel South imposed upon by an overreaching North. Yeah, that's where this shit came from. So this violence that was unleashed upon the Reconstruction governments included targeted assassinations and intimidation of Black and white teachers and community leaders, elected officials who were murdered, beaten, driven from their homes. Talked about the Colfax massacre in the first hour in Louisiana. Armed white militias killed over 100 Black militiamen. Yes, Black people had militias at one time. Killed over 100 Black militiamen who were defending the local courthouse, effectively ending Republican control in that parish. This is why Louisiana, to this day, and we know this from when? From Katrina. There are some places in Louisiana where Black folks to this day don't go because of this kind of violence. Then the paramilitary groups that patrol polling places, armed with guns and whips to keep Black people from voting for Republican candidates. They held rifle club parades and threatened economic ruin, loss of jobs, and evictions for Black folks and white folks who voted for Republicans. The coup d'etat against state governments that were carried out by these white mobs in Mississippi in 1875, a campaign of terror known as the Mississippi Plan used widespread violence to ensure Democratic victory in elections. And these people talking about somebody in another country stole an election, and these motherfuckers flat out murdered people. President Ulysses S. Grant refused to send federal troops to intervene, largely because Northern folks were tired of the Reconstruction effort. They didn't want to support Reconstruction anymore because they got tired of hearing about it. They were tired of supporting things being done with their tax dollars for the Blacks. I'm not kidding. That was the conversation that a whole lot of white folks in the North had during Reconstruction. Oh my God, why are we paying for all these schools for all these Negroes? Why are we doing this for all the Negroes? Why are the Negroes going to get this? So they were like, okay, you know what? No more. We are tired of supporting Reconstruction. So when white people started killing Black people and white supporters of the Reconstruction efforts in the South, white folks in the North were like, fuck you. I don't care. I'm tired of you. I hope you die. And a lot of us did. Then in South Carolina in 1876, red shirts, another white supremacist fascist militia, disrupted Republican rallies, murdered supporters, and engaged in open warfare to secure the election of Democrat Wade Hampton as governor. Don't say shit to me about nobody stealing a damn election in another country again. The Battle of Liberty Place in 1874 in New Orleans saw the White League. Now, this is 3 white supremacist militias that I just told you about. The Ku Klux Klan, I'm sure you knew about them. The red shirts, probably hadn't heard about them. And the White League, I know you haven't heard about them, who openly battled and temporarily seized control of the city of New Orleans from the integrated state government. These were all coups against the Reconstruction governments in this country. The political outcome of this backlash against Reconstruction was the Compromise of 1877. This violence created a crisis in the 1876 presidential election. Results in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. Louisiana was the last Republican, these three states, rather, were the last Republican held states, the last Reconstruction era government states that were still in power. These elections were disputed. Speaking of disputed elections, they tell you what happens in the United States when they dispute an election. These elections were disputed with both parties claiming victory amid widespread intimidation and fraud. But the federal compromise of 1877 resolved the election in favor of the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes in exchange for, and I got to stop right here, take a little breath, because this is where, I think this is probably where we anti-imperialists are very clear on the nature of bipartisanship, and where we understand this claim that comes from modern Republicans that we're the party of Lincoln and we're the party that fought against slavery and we freed the bullshit. Because even though the Compromise of 1877 resolved a claim of election impasse between the Democrat and the Republican candidates, the Compromise of 1877 resolved the election in favor of the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes in exchange for the withdrawal of all remaining federal troops from the South. This meant that the last three states that had Reconstruction governments, that had governments with Black elected officials, that had governments with Black elected officials who were formerly enslaved people, that had governments with Black elected officials who had formerly enslaved people and poor white people elected to those governments, that got together and came up with progressive policies that would have benefited the working class and poor in all of those states over the landowners and the former slaveholders. The Republicans, who allegedly fought against slavery, agreed to withdraw all remaining federal troops from those states with the last remaining Reconstruction governments. They knew what was going to happen because it was already happening. The fascist white supremacist violence against freed Black people was going on during the Civil War. It got worse immediately after the Civil War, and it ratcheted up and continued during the Reconstruction era. And it reached an incredible height when the Republicans agreed to withdraw the federal troops from the last Reconstruction government states. The federal abandonment of the protection of Black people was also the federal abandonment of Black civil and political rights. The end of Reconstruction was the removal of federal troops, and that marked the official end of Reconstruction, because without that protection, the last Republican governments in the South, they didn't collapse. They were violently couped by these white supremacist militias with fascist violence. This led to the rise of these redeemer governments, these all-white, conservative, Democratic Party governments that took control across the South. They saw their role as redeeming white Southern society from the scourge of Negro domination. That's what they thought of Reconstruction governments and Black elected officials governing over them in any kind of way. They didn't want any kind of Negro dominance. And then the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, the violent coup of the last remaining Reconstruction era governments ushered in the Jim Crow era. Over the next 2 decades, these new governments, these new Redeemer governments, these white conservative Redeemer governments in the South enacted black codes and Jim Crow laws that institutionalized racial segregation, economic peonage, and legal disenfranchisement through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, that kind of stuff, and the reign of terror through the fascist white supremacist violence and lynching continued. And they not only continued, but it became tools of social control for decades to come. Decades. The Compromise of 1877, like I said earlier, is also fascinating because it's one of those early examples, I think, of why bipartisanship is shit. Is why every time I hear somebody say, oh, this is a bipartisan agreement, I know we've been sold out, because that's what bipartisanship is. Every time the so-called right and so-called left party, they're both right parties, by the way. There is no left party, political party in this country. They're both right parties. There is a far right fascist party, and then there is a center right party, that is the Democrats. But these two, every time they compromise, the compromise is always us. It's always the people. The compromise that these two political parties make is always the people and our needs and our rights every single time. And learning about this, the Compromise of 1877, this is when I became convinced that that's true. And how can you say it's not true, seeing what compromise and bipartisanship always looks like for us today? So this is the political deal, the Compromise of 1877, that struck the political blow to the Reconstruction governments, right? So this history of fascist violence, of fascist coups against democratically elected governments. Understand, and I think maybe people in this country who do not know this history and don't understand the impact that it has on everything going on in the world today, maybe they don't understand that the people in these Reconstruction governments, the black men, the formerly enslaved, they were voted, they were elected these were democratically elected governments and government officials in these Reconstruction governments. So if white people of any political persuasion in this country who had political power, and even those who didn't have political power, but who didn't have a problem killing people to get political power, if they had no problem using fascist violence to overturn democratically elected state governments here, what in the world makes you think the descendants of these people are ever telling the truth about the people they coup around the world? It's the same ideology. It's the grandchildren and the great grandchildren and the great great grandchildren of the people who did this shit to Reconstruction. It's the same ideology. But because we don't know this history, we don't understand this. This is why I love talking about this stuff so much. Because I'm hoping that people are seeing and hearing the connections, and I'm hoping a light bulb's going off somewhere so we can stop saying dumbass shit like, how can this country be like this? Oh, this is not the country I grew up in. This is the America I know. Yes, it is, idiot. This is the America that has always existed. This is the America that was planned, motherfucker. This is it. Oh, I've been saving these cuss words up. So look, we all know that even with all of this repression and fascism and violence, we all know that the descendants of the people who cooed the Reconstruction governments continued. to organize, to water down, and make that 20th century civil rights legislation that the fascist violence that ended Reconstruction governments and policies didn't come about until the 1950s and the 1960s. That's how long the fascist coup against Reconstruction really lasted. It wasn't just the end of Reconstruction at the end of that 12-year period after the Civil War. The fascist coup against Reconstruction continued until the Civil Rights Act legislations were finally voted on and adopted in the 1950s and 1960s and then the early and mid 1970s. But even then, we all know that the descendants of the people who cooed the Reconstruction governments continued to organize, to water down, and make those 20th century civil rights laws so toothless that it was easier for them to not adhere to the law while lying about how unfair the laws were to white people and perpetuate the continued economic, social, and political disenfranchisement and marginalization of the descendants of the people who tried to make this hellhole a more perfect union and tried, really tried, actually had power to do it for a very short period of time, almost did. But white supremacy said, fuck that. Nope, no equality for you. Now, here's the really fascinating part of this discussion, and I hope that this makes sense. Do we ever ask ourselves what would have happened if the Reconstruction governments established in the American South after the Civil War had been allowed to continue without violent overthrow and federal abandonment? Do we ever ask what would have happened if we had left Haiti alone? Do we ever ask what would have happened if we left Cuba alone? If we left Zimbabwe alone? If we had never invaded Vietnam? What would have happened if we never got involved in Korea? What would have happened? Do you understand? What would have happened if Reconstruction had been left to develop? We can guess, right? So I think, and I think Eric Foner talks about this, and so does William Barber, but Eric Foner's books are better, honestly. Um, Black political power, we people forget because we don't know this history that Black people had political power in this country for exactly 12 years after the end of the Civil War. That's what the Reconstruction governments were. They were the first example of Black power in this country, I think. So, if those Reconstruction governments had been left alone, we would have had sustained Black political power. We had already begun a coalition with Black freedmen, Northern white folks, and Southern white folks, right? We had elected Black officials to state legislatures, Congress, local offices, Black teachers, Black people as the heads of institutions, sharing of power. That could have expanded and a real democracy, a real representative participatory democracy could have been established. Two-party competition in the South might have been a real thing had the Reconstruction governments been left alone. The Republican Party might have remained competitive in the South if the Republicans had not left the South after the Compromise of 1877, because this is the thing that a lot of people don't know. When the federal troops were withdrawn from the South, a lot of the white Republicans left the South with them because they knew what was coming. So the Republican Party, instead of standing and fighting for what they said they believed was right, they left. They not only agreed to remove the only protection of freed people and the new Reconstruction governments from fascist white folks in the South, but they left with them. If they had stayed, the South wouldn't have fallen to the racist Democratic Party, right? Because if the Republicans had stayed, they could have prevented the rise of the solid Democratic South as a one party disenfranchising racist rule. But they left with the federal troops that they agreed to take out of the South in exchange for their candidate being president. Their candidate, who also agreed to appoint a Republican to a post in his administration, or a Democrat. Yes, a slavery supporting white supremacist Democrat to a post in his administration, and he did. Rutherford B. Hayes appointed a white supremacist slavery supporting Democrat to postmaster general. If the Reconstruction governments had been left alone, women's suffrage would have happened a lot sooner than it did, because some Reconstruction era debates included discussions of universal suffrage, and Black political networks formed earlier alliances with women's rights movements, and some Reconstruction governments did include constitutions which extended the right to vote to landless peasants, landless poor white people, and women. Mm-hmm. Speaking of landless poor white people, Reconstruction governments advanced the potential for land redistribution. The most radical policy from these Reconstruction governments was the implementation of General Sherman's Field Order Number 15, as we call it, 40 acres and a mule, and land confiscating and redistribution programs like it from former Confederates to freed people. This could have created a foundational Black economic independence, a major reversal of the actual sharecropping debt peonage system that developed. If General Sherman's Field Order Number 15 had been left alone, and if the Freedmen's Bureau had been left alone, and if the Reconstruction governments had been left alone to carry out and expand those policies and the support those institutions provided for those policies, we wouldn't be talking about needing reparations because of an economic or a racial wealth gap in this country today. We would not. I'm not saying we would have the same level of wealth as white people, because I'm not sure we would ever have been able to catch up to and overcome 300 years of forced economic inequality. But we would be in a completely different and a much better economic and political position that we are in than we are in today, had Reconstruction been left alone. Then we would have also had a more equitable labor system, because with political power, Black workers might have negotiated better terms in Southern agriculture and early industry, potentially slowing or altering the rise of the exploitation of the Jim Crow economy. Public education. Reconstruction governments established the South's first public school systems. Continued funding and protection of these, we wouldn't be as stupid as we are. Now, honestly, I don't know. I don't know how else to say it. There's no need to use a whole bunch of other words to to say that if the Reconstruction governments had been left alone, and the public education system in the South had stayed under the supervision and the support of the people who had been oppressed in the South before, y'all wouldn't be as stupid as you are today. But because the white people who violently cooed the Reconstruction governments want you to be stupid, so you don't know these things. And then, of course, there is Jim Crow. If the Reconstruction governments had been left alone, no legalized segregation or disenfranchisement through Jim Crow would likely have happened. The Black codes and later Jim Crow laws, because the Black codes came first and Jim Crow after, were imposed after Reconstruction was violently couped by fascist violence. With federal troops remaining and Reconstruction governments intact, the 14th and 15th Amendments would have been enforced. Earlier civil rights advancements, a century of segregation, lynching, violent racial terrorism might have been prevented or drastically reduced had the Reconstruction governments been left alone, had the Republicans not agreed to pull the federal troops out of the South and remove protection from Black people and the Black led Reconstruction governments. The civil rights movement might have occurred in the late 19th century or the early 20th century, and it probably would have looked very differently instead of it happening in the mid to late 20th century. Right? This struggle would have kicked off sooner, and it would not have been as intense if it would have needed to have been kicked off at all. Now, I know that there would have been resistance still from white people who would have resisted the Reconstruction governments every day if they had been left alone. So we would still be fighting white resistance to our equality and enfranchisement and political power in this country. Yeah, we would have still. I believe that. But the struggle would look different. I think it would be less intense. We would be fighting for less equal rights because we will have established a more equal society through the progressive policies of the Reconstruction governments. So we would have been fighting for different things, right? I think we would have still been fighting a civil rights movement, but it would have looked differently had that civil rights movement occurred at the end of an extended period of the establishment and development of Reconstruction policies, which would have, I think the struggle would have been of a civil rights movement at the end of an extended Reconstruction period. I think that civil rights movement would have been extending Reconstruction policies from the South to the North. I think that's what the fight would have been. But we'll never know, would we? Because the fascists couped the Reconstruction governments. We would have more integrated civic institutions, public facilities, transportations. The justice system might have remained at least legally integrated and more fair on paper, I think, through social customs, or although social customs still would have changed slowly because people, right? And like I said early, land ownership and access to education would have led to significantly greater intergenerational wealth accumulation for us and indigenous people and those immigrants who couldn't migrate to whiteness. Right? If Reconstruction governments had been left alone, we might not be rich, but we wouldn't be economically where we are. Without this solid Southern national political landscape, the South, and we're seeing that change a little bit today with some Southern states. We see it with the elections, with these pundits saying, "Oh, this state flipped blue." We're seeing a little bit of that now, but since the coup of Reconstruction, the South has been the South, and it has voted as the South against progressivism. Period. That is how the South has been since the fascist coup of Reconstruction. If Reconstruction governments had been left alone, national elections would have been more competitive because there would have been a more competitive Republican or anti white supremacist, allegedly, if they really were, would have been more competitive if they had stayed in the South and not abandoned. And that could have potentially sped up progressive reforms like labor rights and social welfare, as both parties would have had to compete for black votes. But they don't want to do that. They just want to tell us they just want to tell us who we gonna vote for or else. And then if we don't, then they're gonna cuss us out and tell us we ain't shit. And then after that, they're gonna tell us, and that's why we ain't doing nothing for you, because you didn't do what we told you to do. Vote for us. That's why you ain't shit, and that's why we ain't doing shit for you. But really, they just ain't gonna do shit for us no way. Whether we vote for them or not, because they don't have to. And this history basically proves that. Because they made sure that we have no power to make them. The narrative of Reconstruction as a failure, because that's what white people, especially the folks who believe in the lost cause mythology, that's what they say. Reconstruction failed. This mythology might not have taken hold. And the collective memory of the Civil War and emancipation would be a lot less full of bullshit if the Reconstruction governments had been left alone. If the federal government had bothered to rein in the fascist murderers that couped the Reconstruction governments. But nobody went to prison. And by the way, when I'm talking about the violent fascist coups of the Reconstruction governments, I'm talking about things like the Red Scare, the Red Summer. I'm talking about the race riots throughout the South. That's what these things were connected to. If the Reconstruction governments had been left alone and those penitentiaries that the Reconstruction government constitutions established, the Klan, the white leagues, the red shirts, the sheriffs and the judges and the regular white folks who participated in these race riots, murdering and lynching our ancestors and their white allies, they would have been in those penitentiaries. But because they were allowed to coup the Reconstruction governments, none of those people were ever held accountable for any of the crimes they committed. None. So when I look at the federal government and I understand that sustaining Reconstruction would have required a lasting political will from the North and the federal government to enforce that equality, and knowing that that will melted like ice in the sun. Ooh, like ice in the sun. Ooh, that was good. I know that nothing made them change their mind about being committed to, doing right by the descendants of the Africans that they did wrong for 300 years. I know that nothing made them change their mind about doing right by the indigenous that they genocided. Nothing changed their mind other than their own racism and capitalist greed based on racism. That's why their will to enforce and stay committed to ensuring that this equality comes about, that's why they abandoned it, because they really did not believe in the things that were being pushed forward by these progressive Reconstruction governments. So when we look at these political parties today and we see how they both hate progressives, it has always been that way. Always. And I can't leave the impact on the South itself out. Because as much as the Southern politicians and military and slave owners needed to have been punished, and none of them were, had the Reconstruction governments been left alone, the South's economy today would be a lot more stable than it is. The South's economy would still have needed diversification, but with a more empowered Black population, it might have developed along less unequal lines. And it would have been a hell of a lot more stable than it is today. But that's not what they wanted. That is not what the fascist white supremacists wanted. They didn't want economic stability. They didn't want social inequality. They didn't want equal democratic representation and access. They wanted social, political, and economic dominance. And they violently couped the Reconstruction governments, and the people elected to run them to make sure that that equality, that those progressive policies never came about in this country. But too many people in this country really hated the idea of black and brown and red and yellow and whatever other non-European descended people are here being equal in any way to them, the descendants of the European settler colonists, in this America that they claimed as their own, but actually stole from the indigenous people and produced profits off the forced free labor of Africans and their descendants, us, as well as the violent exploitation of immigrant labor that they pocketed, the white European descendants, and passed down to their children and children's children and children's children's children, while sending their great 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 grandchildren like Charlie Kirk them out onto college campuses and high school campuses to lie about the 150 years of laziness and bad choices, the descendants of the freedmen who were murdered because they pursued equality for all with the state power they briefly held, while making the case that it has always been the Negroes and the immigrants and the Indians who have stolen progress and prosperity from the hapless and unfortunate, hardworking, white working class man. But that shit is all a lie. This history proves it's a lie, and that is why they don't want you to know this history, because when they're standing there lying in your face about this history, you don't know it, so you can't counter their damn lies. So they are standing there, and this is what Charlie Kirk did: lied through his teeth about why Black people are in the position we are in now, why immigrants are treated so badly, why so many immigrants come to this country, because we don't know the why, because they don't want us to know the why, because they keep the why from us. You don't learn the real why in school. You can't counter their lies. So you end up believing that what they're saying, well, it sounds like it makes sense. It must be true. And you end up siding with the capitalist, fascist dictators who are the descendants of the people who did all this shit in the first place. This is why we need to know this history. This is why this history is practically the only thing I talk about, because it gives us insight into why the political and economic leaders of this country support the inhuman policies they do against who they support them against. This history also explains to us why they generally don't do this kind of shit to Europeans, with the exception of countries like Russia, because they don't see Russians as Europeans. They see them as Asians, and Russia used to be communist, so that Russia gonna stay. Even if Russia is not communist now, and they're not, as long as they are against US empire, Russia gonna stay on the US's shit list. These folks really believe that other people's countries belong to them to do as they please, because they were allowed, they made sure they could do as they pleased in this country in every single horrific instance. Every time we challenged them for their oppression, they murdered us. Point blank, period. What negotiation? They just flat out fucking lynched us. The violent, undemocratic, inhuman, and militaristic fascism that we see unleashed upon countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Nigeria, through their comprador leaders welcoming US bombings, Haiti still, and the continued and escalating fascist repression that is expanded to non-racialized communities with the ICE murder of Renee Nicole Good in Minneapolis, the shooting of 2 people in Portland just yesterday, the 5 previous shootings of immigrants, and the young Black man by ICE, that corporate media didn't really bother reporting before the first two this week: the announced repression of left-leaning organizations and individuals through the Antifa and NSPM 7 policies coming from this regime, the apparent plans to take ICE raids door to door, all stem from the ideology established in the developmental years of this country, when human bondage based on race was legal for 288 years, after ethnic cleansing and genocide was carried out against the indigenous to steal land from tens of millions of those people by people who claimed they were just weary Christians escaping religious repression in Europe. They established their liberty, their freedom, and their prosperity on the broken bodies and buried bones of our ancestors. They told us to stop talking about the 500 years of torture our people that they got rich off of, as they expanded that torture to other people in other countries for even more unearned and undeserved and stolen profit. They told us to shut the fuck up about it. You should be glad to be an American. But if you're not clear that everything going on in every country around the world that this country is involved in, where the people are opposing US and Western imperialism, is connected to us in every way imaginable, then I have to conclude that you simply do not care. That their suffering is our responsibility to stop, because we know these demons best, because it's the same playbook they're using there against those people that they have already used against us. And if that is the case, that you just don't care, then I have no choice but to place you on the other side of the barricades, away from us, on the side of the enemy. Don't worry though. You sure as hell won't be over there alone. So thank you all so much for hanging out with me. Thanks for coming over, for those of you who did, for this extended dark room. I'm going to try to get my graphics a little bit better and timely and on point this year. I am planning, and this is the announcement that I'm making to you all, you are hearing it first, Imprint of Imperialism will return. And this season, we are going to walk through the book Killing Hope by William Bloom. Every episode of Imprint of Imperialism will highlight a chapter in Killing Hope, so we can understand that the United States government has never in its existence brought democracy, freedom, or liberty to any country for any reason, in any context, but certainly not with its fucking military. So, thank you all so much. I appreciate you. Please support Lukman Nation on Patreon, patreon.com/Lukman Nation, LUQMANNATION. And I will see you all next week. Thank you so much for your support. See you on the other side. Peace.